The smell of my mother's perfume was still on the cardigan I wore to her funeral, and my stepmother had the nerve to hand me an invoice 3 days later. It was a Tuesday. I remember because I'd just gotten back from the grocery store. I was the one who'd been doing all the shopping, all the cooking, all the cleaning for the past 8 months while my mother was dying in the guest room, and my father pretended nothing unusual was happening in his house. I set the bags down on the kitchen counter and found a folded piece of paper propped against the fruit bowl. Typed. Printed. Like a business document. Monthly household contribution due the first of each month. $950. I stood there reading it twice. My stepmother, Beverly. I'll call her that because that's her name, and she's earned the right to have her name attached to what she did. Was sitting at the kitchen table with her reading glasses on, not looking up from her magazine. Your father and I talked about it, she said. You're 31 years old. It's only fair. I'd moved back home 2 years earlier when my mother got her diagnosis. Stage 4. The doctors gave her 14 months and she made it to 19, which felt like both a miracle and the longest grief of my life. I'd given up my apartment in Columbus, transferred my bookkeeping job to remote, and come back to the house I grew up in to spend whatever time was left with her. My father had remarried Beverly 4 years before that. 6 months, I want to be clear, 6 months after my parents finalized their divorce, and she had never once pretended to be anything other than inconvenienced by my existence. But I stayed. For my mother. I slept in my childhood bedroom. I drove my mother to her chemo appointments. I held her hand during the bad nights. I watched her get smaller and smaller until the Tuesday in March when she stopped breathing with her head on my shoulder and her favorite quilt pulled up to her chin. And 3 days after I buried her, I was handed a rent invoice. I didn't say anything to Beverly that afternoon. I folded the paper back up, put it in my pocket, and went upstairs. I told myself I'd talk to my father when he got home. I told myself it was a misunderstanding. That's what you do when you've grown up in a house where keeping the peace felt like a survival skill. You rationalize, you wait, you hope the reasonable version of events turns out to be true. My father got home at 6:30. I heard him and Beverly talking in the kitchen for a long time before I came down. By the time I sat across from him at the dinner table, he already had his explanation ready. You have income, he said. This house houses expenses. Beverly and I think it's time you contributed. Dad, Mom just died. I know that. He said it like I was the one being unreasonable. And I know this is hard, but life keeps moving, sweetheart. Bills don't stop. Beverly set a casserole dish on the table without looking at me. I moved out the next morning. I didn't have a plan. I called my friend Petra from the driveway with my car loaded up and asked if I could sleep on her couch. She said yes without asking a single question, which is how I know she's the real thing. What I didn't know yet, what I wouldn't find out for another 4 months, was that life keeps moving was the most honest thing my father had said to me in years. Because while my mother was dying in that guest room, life had been moving very specifically in the direction of her bank accounts. I need to back up. My parents met in 1987 at a community college in Dayton. They were married for 22 years, and whatever their problems were, and there were some, I'm not pretending otherwise, my father was not a dishonest man. Or, I didn't think he was. My father was not a dishonest man. Or I didn't think he was. He coached my little league team. He came to every school play. He called me every Sunday for the first 2 years I lived in Columbus just to check in. When he told me he and my mother were separating, I was 26 and I thought I understood. People grow apart. It happens. I was sad, but I wasn't angry. Then he introduced me to Beverly 8 weeks later, and I did the math. And I felt something go cold in my chest that never quite warmed back up. Beverly had a son from her first marriage, a 24-year-old named Tyler, who moved into my father's house the same month she did. Tyler didn't work in any consistent way. He fixed motorcycles sometimes, sold things on Facebook Marketplace, borrowed money from Beverly that came, I would later understand, from my father. He was the kind of person who filled up a room with a specific energy, not hostile, exactly, just always slightly angled toward what he could get from a situation. My father thought Tyler was great, called him the son I never had, which he said in front of me once without seeming to notice. I kept my distance. I visited for holidays, kept things civil, and told myself it wasn't my life to manage. My mother had her own apartment by then, a small place near the library that she'd made genuinely beautiful. She seemed lighter there even before she got sick. I think leaving had been the right thing for her, even if the circumstances were what they were. When she got her diagnosis, I made the choice to come home. My mother's apartment wasn't set up for the kind of care she was going to need, and my father's house had a proper guest room, and my father, to his credit, or so I believed, had agreed immediately. Of course, he'd said. She's family. I moved in August. By October, I'd noticed that Beverly was spending a significant amount of time going through my mother's things. My mother couldn't get around well by then. She kept her important documents in a canvas tote bag that she brought with her from her apartment: insurance papers, her will, her bank information. I'd helped her transfer everything over when we moved her in. Beverly had offered to help organize things, and my mother, who was exhausted and medicated and trusted people because she had always trusted people, had let her. I didn't think much of it at the time. I was too busy being a caregiver to be suspicious. Looking back, I want to shake myself. My mother passed in March. I moved out in March. I spent April and May at Petra's, working my remote bookkeeping job from her spare bedroom and trying to figure out what the next version of my life looked like. My mother had left me something. Not a lot. Her apartment had cleaned out most of her savings, and what was left after her medical bills was modest. But she'd had a small whole life insurance policy she'd carried since before I was born, with me listed as the sole beneficiary. $50,000. It wasn't life-changing money, but it was something. It was her wanting to make sure I was okay. I filed the claim in April. It was denied in May. The letter from the insurance company said the policy had been modified 14 months ago. The beneficiary had been changed. The new beneficiary on record was my father. I read that sentence 4 times in Petra's spare bedroom with the door closed and the ceiling fan turning slowly above my head. Then I picked up my phone and called the insurance company's customer service line and spent 40 minutes being transferred between departments before someone confirmed, yes, the change had been processed. Yes, it appeared to be a standard beneficiary update form. Yes, there was a signature on file. My mother's signature. 14 months ago, my mother could barely hold a pen. I want to be careful here about what I say and what I can prove. I'm not a lawyer. I didn't understand in that moment in Petra's spare bedroom exactly what I was looking at, but I'd spent 8 months as my mother's primary caregiver. I'd been with her at almost every appointment. I knew what her cognition was like 14 months ago. I knew what her hands were like, and I knew that she had told me, sitting in the backyard on a warm evening in October with a cup of tea she couldn't quite finish, that she wanted me to use that money to get back on my feet. "Promise me you won't just blow it on something stupid," she'd said, and laughed a little because we both knew I wasn't the type. I promised her. Then I called a lawyer. Her name was Ms. Okafor, and she worked out of a small office in a strip mall in Westerville. And she was the most competent person I have ever encountered in a professional setting. I found her through a legal aid referral because I couldn't afford a retainer, and she agreed to take a consultation for a flat fee that I put on a credit card I was trying not to think about. I sat across from her and laid out everything I knew. The insurance beneficiary change. The timing. My mother's condition at the time the paperwork was supposedly signed. The rent invoice Beverly had handed me 3 days after the funeral. Ms. Okafor listened without interrupting. She took notes. When I finished, she asked me one question. "Did your mother have any other accounts or assets that you're aware of?" I told her about the checking account, a savings account with maybe $12,000 in it, a small CD that was supposed to mature in 18 months. Miss Okafor suggested I request a copy of my mother's financial records going back 2 years. It took 3 weeks to pull everything together through the estate process. What I found when I finally sat down with those bank statements is something I still have trouble describing without my hands shaking a little. Between the month Beverly started going through my mother's things and the month my mother died, there had been 11 transfers out of my mother's savings account. The amounts varied: 600 here, 1,400 there, once a single transfer of $4,000. They went to an account I didn't recognize. When Miss O'Coffer traced it, the account belonged to Tyler, Beverly's son, who fixed motorcycles and sold things on Facebook Marketplace. $31,000 over 7 months, taken from a woman who was dying and who trusted the people in that house. I sat in Ms. O'Coffer's office when she told me, and I didn't cry. I'd been crying for months, and I think I'd hit some kind of floor. I just sat there feeling very still and very certain about what I needed to do next. "What are my options?" I said. The next part moved faster than I expected and slower than I wanted. Ms. O'Coffer filed a civil suit and simultaneously referred the financial records to the county prosecutor's office. Elder financial exploitation is a crime in Ohio, and my mother, even though she was 61 and most people don't think of 61 as elderly, qualified under the statute because of her medical condition and cognitive impairment. The beneficiary change was flagged for investigation by the State Insurance Fraud Unit. I went back to my father's house once during this time. I want to be honest about why. I needed a box of my mother's things that I'd left in the guest room closet, letters she'd written me, a photograph from her college graduation, small things that I couldn't let disappear. I called first, my father answered, and I told him I was coming to get a few items from the guest room. He said fine. He didn't ask how I was. When I got there, Beverly was standing in the front hallway. She looked at me the way people look at something they're trying to decide whether to be afraid of. "We've heard from a lawyer," she said. "I know," I said. "I have one too." She stepped aside. I went upstairs. I got my box. I walked back downstairs past Beverly and past Tyler, who was sitting in the living room watching television, and past my father, who had appeared in the kitchen doorway and was looking at me with an expression I didn't have a word for. Not quite guilt. Not quite anger. Something caught between them. "You didn't have to do this," he said. I stopped walking. I turned around and I looked at my father, this man who coached my little league team and called me every Sunday, and I said, "She was my mother." I left. I didn't look back. The investigation took 4 months. I want to be honest about those 4 months, because I think there's a version of this kind of story where the narrator floats above the hard parts and only lands for the dramatic moments. And that's not what it was actually like. I went back to work. I got up every morning at Petra's, and I made coffee, and I opened my laptop, and I did bookkeeping for small businesses, and I tried to keep myself from checking my email every 20 minutes for updates from Ms. O'Coffer. Petra's cat slept at the foot of my bed every night, and I found that more comforting than I would have expected. I called my aunt, my mother's sister, and she cried, and then I cried, and then we talked about my mother for 2 hours, which was the best phone call I had during that entire period. I also did something practical. I'd been doing bookkeeping remotely, and I was good at it, and I'd started to notice that several of my clients were completely disorganized in ways that were costing them money. I started offering a small advisory service. Not accounting, I'm not a CPA, just basic financial organization, catching errors, flagging deductions they were missing. 2 clients said yes, then 4. I started charging for it. By August, I was making enough from the combined work to rent a studio apartment in Clintonville, and I moved out of Petra's spare room with a box of groceries and a secondhand couch and my mother's cardigan folded in a drawer. It wasn't triumph, it was just the ordinary work of starting over, but it was mine. In September, Miss Okafor called me on a Wednesday morning while I was eating cereal at my kitchen counter. Beverly had accepted a plea agreement. Felony charges, financial exploitation of an elderly or disabled adult, 2 counts. She would serve 18 months in a minimum security facility, followed by 3 years of supervised probation. She was ordered to pay restitution of $31,000, the full amount taken from my mother's accounts. Tyler had been charged separately. He took a deal for the same restitution amount, plus community service and probation, no jail time, which I have complicated feelings about, but which Ms. Okafor explained was consistent with how these cases usually resolve when there's a single primary organizer. The insurance beneficiary change was determined to be fraudulent. The policy reverted to me as the named beneficiary under the original designation. The $50,000 came through in October. My father was not charged with anything. The investigators found no evidence that he had known about the account transfers or the beneficiary fraud. I have spent a lot of time sitting with that finding, and I still don't know entirely what to do with it. Maybe he genuinely didn't know. Maybe he looked away because it was easier than looking at it directly. I can't see inside him. What I know is that he didn't protect my mother, and he didn't protect me. And in the end, the only people who did either of those things were Ms. Okafor and Petra and my aunt and a county prosecutor I never met in person. My father called me the week the plea was announced. I let it go to voicemail. He said he was sorry. He said he didn't know. He said he was sorry. He said he didn't know. He said he hoped I would give him the chance to explain someday. I haven't called him back. I don't know if I will. The first thing I did with the insurance money was pay off the credit card I'd used for Ms. Okafoler's initial consultation. Then I paid Petra back for every month of rent she refused to charge me. She argued about it, but I left a check on her kitchen table, and she eventually deposited it. Then I set aside 6 months of expenses in a savings account that only I can access, because I understand now in a way I didn't before what it means to have no cushion. The rest I've been sitting with. Some of it will go toward a down payment on a place of my own. Some of it I donated to an organization in my mother's name that provides in-home support to people with terminal diagnoses, because I know from experience that the caregivers in those situations are often running on empty. And sometimes the most important thing is just having someone else show up and help carry the weight for a few hours. I kept working. The advisory service grew. I'm not going to tell you I became some kind of success story, because that's not the point, and it's also not really what happened. What happened is that I found out I was capable of more than I'd given myself credit for, which is a quieter thing and a truer one. I live in a one-bedroom apartment in Clintonville now. I have a window that gets good morning light and a small balcony where I've been attempting to keep Basil alive, with mixed results. My mother's photograph from her college graduation is on my bookshelf. I wear her cardigan when the weather turns. Some nights I sit on the balcony and I think about the version of events where I found that rent invoice and just paid it, where I didn't call a lawyer, where I told myself it wasn't worth the fight, the way I'd been telling myself things weren't worth the fight for most of my adult life. I think about how easy it would have been to let it go, and then I think about my mother telling me not to blow it on something stupid and laughing a little, and how I promised her I wouldn't. I kept that promise. It just turned out the promise meant something different than either of us knew.